Good afternoon and most welcome to H1015B. This will be continuation with my little chat earlier on with a fantastic book by Richard E. Lind, The Seat of Consciousness in Ancient Literature. And now I finally found the quote. Well, it's a secondary quote. The first one is coming from Carl Jung, and he's referring to an Indian of the Taos Pueblos in New Mexico in the 30s, and his name is Ochviai Biano. Quote, "See," Ochviai Biano said, "how cruel the whites look. Their lips are thin, their noses sharp, their faces furrowed and distorted by folds. Their eyes have a staring expression. They are always seeking something. What are they seeking? The white always want something. They are always uneasy and restless. We don't know what they want. We don't understand them. We think they are mad." I asked him why he thought the whites were all mad. That was coming from Jung. They said they think with their heads. He replied, "Why, of course. What do you think?" Jung asked him with a surprise. "We think here," he said, indicating to his chest. And from this, Lind writes the following. From a primitive, or in this case, from an indigenous American point of view, there is apparently a sharp contrast between their heart-centered location and functioning of consciousness and head-centered modern consciousness, the latter being a form of madness, i.e. loss or absence of heart soul, or more technically in modern Western terms, a fixation in immaturity. That is, a failure to awaken the heart soul. According to Ochviai Biano's diagnosis, the symptoms of this failure are characterized by, among other things, an uneasy and restless seeking, and by thinking with the head. And I mentioned earlier that Richard E. Lind had a couple of explanations why this process started, and some of them actually struck a chord in with me, and was this with the development in youth. When we hit adolescence, we develop the first time a sort of awareness, and I remember this very keenly myself. I was able to look at my own thinking, and it caught me by surprise. I never done that before in my life, and I felt it first so odd, but then I felt, oh, I got a sort of an extra ability now, and that later on meant I could choose reactions I preferred, and I could sort of steer away from reactions I didn't like. So all of a sudden there was a possibility of a conscious choice. Whereas earlier, when I was still a toddler, I just reacted. There was nothing else to it. And I even reacted to my own thinking. So it was like ready-made steps that were started from the beginning. And since they were started, there was no regress. And something often accompanied from my mother's side, "Don't you start again. I know where this is heading." The same movie all again. And all of a sudden, in this adolescent stage, I was able to avoid the thinking line, the succession of thoughts that always led to the very same thing. And later on, it became more and more a sort of a knowing. I know also which situation to stir away from. I know, for instance, the coffee breaks with my elder uncles was something to be avoided, since I didn't like coffee, and neither did I like the sort of discussion they had, because it was way too complicated for my simple youth mind. So it became a sort of scale-wise development, an evolution of an awareness, and it became stronger and stronger. And this is what Richard E. Lind is pointing to. For the adolescent, there is a development all of a sudden of something that from the beginning was a wholeness, body and soul as one singular thing, and only reactions. And the development of this new thing that Richard E. Lind calls consciousness or attention. And the attention is of a different quality. And he hints that in all cultures, even in the Greek cultures before the time of the pre-Socratics, there used to be initiation rites. And those initiation rites helped the growing youth to sort of integrate both sides of his two sides into one thing. And that initiation rite was very important, and it was also a knowledge guidance from the elders and from a long tradition that could have been going on for millennia, maybe even longer. He indicates later in the book that that tradition could actually be something in the vicinity of 40,000 years in India. It's very amazing. But this helped the adolescents not to split up in two parts. And what will happen if there is no guidance and if there are no initiation rites, there will become a split. And that split is what he refers to the raising of the consciousness to the head, and a short division just in the neck. Just in the neck. Where the neck starts, the body starts. And where the head starts, the spirit or the consciousness or the awareness start. And in this split, a very sharp division becomes something of a fact for the young person. And that is that the body gets all the properties of what was earlier in childhood unconscious, reactive, emotional, conditioned, and it also acquires the status of being of a lower kind. The body is not as good as the head. The head is also not of the world. It's something beyond the world, not of this horrible body world. And the sharpness becomes stronger and stronger, and at the age of 15 or 16 the separation is complete. And of course in Western Hemisphere there is also a supporting language. We have very few terms for the inner side, the inner workings of our mind. We don't have, for instance, in Indian yogi tradition you find different words for the different egos. Some of those we mentioned before, like chitta, ahamkara, the body, which is the intellectual side of the thinking, and in Samkhya those divisions are not here, they are in the whole thing, and those are true divisions. They are actually something you can experience, whereas the body-mind division in this take is random somehow, and every adolescent makes their own division, made because of the struggle it becomes to sort of integrate the two very different parts. And I did actually remember that myself. It was so odd that I still had my sort of unconscious longings, and it became problematic sometimes. If I wanted something strongly, I often referred to the wants of the body, and those were of lower quality, like the one for ice cream or similar. And I see how in the book he sort of draws this into modernity as well. And when I say modernity, I mean the time a little before the birth of our Lord Christ, and that develops more and more and becomes this very, very strong inclination to describe everything in words only and concepts, and make an unjustful equation, and that is everything that is conscious is also words or concepts or something like that, and the body that doesn't have concepts is the unconscious, and that is a premature, rather clumsy division, according to Richard E. Lind. And that clumsy division doesn't have full knowledge of what it should be, the finer, more precise divisions that actually comes from reality itself gets covered over. And all of a sudden what happened in antiquity was that everything became unreal in some way. And this is what he called the constructs of the head consciousness. And one mentioning, of course, is the cave metaphor of Plato. Plato himself felt his whole life that reality was not good enough. He constantly complained that the unreality he was living in. He felt with his whole system that something was missing him. Something was not enough. And he didn't feel satisfaction with the knowledge he gained. And therefrom come this striving, this lust for a greater reality, this dream of having a reality that would heal him and make his world whole again. And that was what we usually call the metaphysics of presence, wanting existence so close you can't even see it, and having the present so much in the moment you can't even be aware of it. So you sort of identify yourself completely, and you don't let the other thing be what it is. It's a sort of a unification that in the same way makes the object of your adornment something you worship, but you also become it in the same process. And in that process you will yourself disappear as the world. And of course this is a sort of an absurd longing, but you can understand it because Plato no longer had any access to reality. His body was cut off from the head, and the head sort of almost like a brain in the vat continued its existence, but all its things were made up by himself. They had to be, because no information was no longer coming from the body. That precious, very important exogenous connection to something that is utterly real, the world. And he lacked that, and he tried to make sort of a substitute because of this lack. Something that could be the same as Jacques Derrida called the supplement, something to add to an original lack, and a supplement that also becomes in the end the proof of the lack, because why add something if you are whole? And somewhere in this process we become singly directed into what we think is the outside, but it's not really the outside either. It's a sort of a limbo, straddled between two worlds, the real world of the objects and existences and the real world of the inner workings of the heart soul, so to speak, according to Richard E. Lind. And in these inventions we become frustrated, and we try to sort of capture this existence more and more, and the more we try to capture it and be the existence and be in the now, the less we have. So it's an endless struggle, and towards his end of his life Plato become more and more bitter, more and more disappointed, and more fearsome. And I think one example is when he took over Syracuse, and he was supposed, together with some other people, have a perfect rule made of gentleness and kindness and understanding, and it became a horror rule, because nothing good can come out of such a division, even though the intentions were absolutely good, because the dividing thing he had in himself was bound to show up in his way of sort of informing the population of Syracuse. And the end of this reign, they were very glad to give up the idea of a benevolent rule by philosophers. And I think that was the last try on that, until recently, when Simpson actually made I didn't understand it first, but they actually made a cartoon of the whole thing. And Syracuse was the main village in the cartoon Simpson, which is called I forgot now, but it's very odd. And in the end, the most benevolent and benign of philosophers come, and that is actually Stephen Hawking. And it's his actual voice that enters into the cartoon, and he tries to give advice that's just horrible, that's just too physical, that's just too non-working. So in the end he says, give that idea up, you should rule yourself instead with your own imagination. And I think this led to an absolute cut in Western tradition, following up the ideas of Richard E. Lind. And here we get this problem of either or, because in the adolescent it was an either or, and it sort of got sold by pushing the body away, making it lower on the hierarchy, and somehow making the soul dependent of the body, because everything the soul is, it is what it is not. It's the negative definition. So everything that is of the body is not the soul, and vice versa. And as we showed earlier, this sort of way of doing things has its weakness, and it's you become dependent on what you sort of try to shove away, and the thing that is the dark side or the shadow side, the marginalized thing. Marginalized and prioritized, they go hand in hand, and that makes taking the body away, even oddly enough, the emotions and the instinct becomes even more strong, because we don't have any control over them, so they can play out their lives as they want. And he's pointing to this development, this inflation of knowledge, because all of a sudden the world cannot be a world in such, it cannot be independent of our thinking anymore. It sort of only exists because we think about it. This is the fantasy of the head. This is the brain in the vat. This is, of course, analytical philosophy, where the world is just an invention. And the body becomes even lower in that invention. It becomes a product of the invention. So it's a derived thing that loses more and more of its vividness, of its prana, of its ki, of its directionality. And all of a sudden, we always feel that we have to sort of solve contradictions. We cannot allow contradictions. As my dear co-author mentioned before, most people today feel it's a horrible contradiction that Jesus could both show contempt for compassion for a leopard, and also
be angry.
Anger. And today that's an impossibility, because we need to resolve all contradictions. We cannot have contradictions at the same time, and all of a sudden we cannot understand ourselves somehow, because it started from a contradiction, something that became a contradiction, and this either or, it blocks out understanding of the body and also of the soul. So that both things gets shied away into darkness and no knowledge. It becomes part of the tea, both of them. So in the end we don't have any alatea, non-uncoveredness. And I want to put in an example I mentioned earlier here, how that actually Could you put in a pause there just a second? Let me get into my example I experienced the other day. I already told my co-author and our dear friend Caroline here, but the other night I woke up because somebody had confused timetable when it came to departure of flights, and he made a terrible miscalculation, and he's almost both missed the flight himself and brought up 5 other people who were going to something really important up in northern part of Sweden. His missus was very, very miffed, to say the least, with him. But I think this double take can make an understanding possible, that we can still have a blame in the external world where blame needs to be made, and responsibilities always have to be made, because that's the working of the real world. But at the same time, we can also have an understanding. And when I say an understanding, I mean it both sort of from a compassionate way, but also an understanding that all people have an inner side as well. And then you can understand that you yourself have an inner side, whereas you deny it and you get stranded in this either-or situation. You will both block out the understanding of others' inner side as well as your own. And it's a more difficult problem, I'd say. And I trust we didn't have a solution until the event of quantum mechanics, because if you were to go one way, we know it will lead to absurd contradictions in the end, as we've shown with the Gödel's theorem and how we've shown with classical physics. So either way you go, it will not end nicely. And having something in between will make things even worse. So what you need to have both ways, and you can call the particle that you could call his own understanding of what happened, or his lack of understanding of what happened, and the wave being the external world, the world we deny, so to speak, a world with real rules and properties that you can't bend because you want them to bend. And that is a strengthening of both sides. You can have this unbendable world, whereas you can still have this open, fantastic, mendable and also controllable world of your inner working. And this is something Biano was pointing to, the quote I started with. The Indian said, no Westerners ever develops. They remain the child they are, incessantly seeking for pleasures, either in their head or in their bodies. And this incessant seeking means they never ever achieve satisfaction, because satisfaction cannot come from such a thing. It cannot come from this absolute need which goes beyond the sheer pleasures of the world. And I think by understanding that quantum mechanics gives us that gift to have both for the first time in physics, in the real world, which is strong enough an evidence for everyone to start understanding, I could actually rebuild my thinking, and I could reverse the disjunction that was made to me, or I made to myself, either or, in adolescency, and sort of heal the whole world. And by being able to have both sides of something, you don't make anything lesser. By seeing the body as separate from the mind and vice versa, nothing gets diminished anymore. This is more of a truer division. It's a division that is not based on pre-made a priori takes, and takes made from the frustration of the adolescent. I can fill in here more. I had a chat with the neurologist Jan Eiskens, and he said directly, this is the cause of the youthful problems we have today with things like autism, ADHD, phenomena that are all new to the modern world. And this is a progressive form of the original split. And that original split can actually be shown on MRI and electroencephalogram, which is in itself very interesting. we can see the split, and it doesn't develop in Eastern cultures at all, because they still kept the initiation rites. They have the knowledge, because without the knowledge coming from your own culture, you cannot do these things, because knowledge is always something of the past, something we learn by testing out or being in the world and being sort of directed to the world at the same time as we are directed to our inner workings. And the both, they do come at the same time. And I said, there's no wonder in Eastern Asia they don't have a problem with contradiction. They wouldn't even have a problem with a Jesus that tried to make money out of people and could be good at the same time, because that is actually the case with many of their philosophers. So that's not problematic for them. And those people are, of course, much realer than this. I sort of think of Xenophanes when he, much earlier than Christendom, tries to make the gods more pure, taking away personality, taking away face for them, taking away strivings and wants that human beings or a god could have, things that are of reality. And what he did in the end was to make gods completely lacking of characteristics of something that could be real. And that was actually criticism put to him at the time. But later that criticism disappeared more and more. And when I had my Xenophanes lecture, people said, wow, he's so modern. This is exactly how we think today. And I said, you should turn that around. You should start to think, what is your modern thinking you think is so modern? It is actually coming from this division early on, that everything that is pure and godlike needs to be rid of all defilement of the real world, of the body, of contradiction. And that striving has nothing to do with Christianity as such. It's the striving coming earlier on. It's well established 300 years BC. So it's much older than that, and it could be that in this development in understanding we lose out on so many things of deeper understanding, both of ourselves and our society. And actually this gave me an explanation for this odd law system, the judicial system of Samoa. It is a country somewhere in the Pacific. And there, they don't make a difference if you cause somebody's death by a car accident, or it was intended, or it was manslaughter. In their lawmaking, it doesn't make any difference at all. And that's the working of how they see cause and effect. But they still see that the person could have been in a specific state that made him do the thing. Unconscious, unaware, sloppy or something like that. So there's still an understanding. And those things are contradictory, but both are accepted at the same time. So they sort of go through the real world business as still sort of retaining the understanding of the inner side. Whereas in the West we usually make some sort of median, some sort of compromise. And I think a good example is the former Chancellor of Law in Sweden, Geijer. In the 70s, he wanted to make a compromise in the law system, and he mixed internal and external. And what he did in the end is said, nobody can be responsible for his ill doings. So he only looked at one side. And what he actually managed to do is take away all the punishable order by 2/3. It was just amazing. Some things that were earlier made punishable by law were no longer, and actually it was a huge disaster. It was a horrible thing. He actually suggested rape at some instance was supposed to be no offense at all, because the man was like driven by his own lust somehow, and that was something of reality. And that is mixing the internal with the external. The external needs still to be working in an external fashion. Otherwise, we both lose out on the external real world of things we can't change, and the internal world. And this is the point of Ochiwai later on. You Westerners have no real world. You don't have trees, you don't have stones, you don't understand that there is a real world you can't affect. And you cannot understand there's an inner world. Some way he understood giving up one means that you give up the other completely. And what he saw was God-fearing men coming into the West, and they had obliterated all material things. But by doing that, they also obliterated everything of spirituality. Both gets lost in the same time. You can't keep one, because you will lose the other one as well. And this is the message of physics, quantum mechanics. It says all divisions you make is going to lose out on both ends. If you make a division, you will be damned either way you do it. This is an English saying. You will be damned if you do, and you will be damned if you don't. It's a sort of a moment 22. And this means we didn't have an option until the event of quantum mechanics. And this is what our Indian friends Thieu-Cassin is mentioning too. He realized Western man don't have a choice somehow, because it's so in our system. So we still make his natural religion into something that is better. It's not material, it's purely spiritual. And he says, Thieu-Cassin, that is just BS, he said actually in one. Because we don't make that divide, you make that divide. We don't see the real world of our ancestors, of trees, of stones, of things that you can touch as something bad. This is reality, and by giving up that, you give up everything about spirituality. And you men of the spirit are the worst, said once actually, because you belong to nowhere. You are in limbo, in the state in between. And he had a word for that, and it was vachaka. Vachaka is between. Somebody who doesn't accept the spiritual world, but neither accept the material world. You lose out on both in the same amount, so to speak. And that's a very interesting point. And that, of course, is something that is pointed out, how the heightening of consciousness into the head that only happened really in Western society can only be healed by understanding such a thing did actually happen in your own adolescence. So you need to go back to that place. And that is not something shared by mere Indians or people living in India or Australia. This is a unique Western trait. It's the only culture that gave up that. And that happened long before Christ, 400 BC. Everything was given up. It's very odd actually. Some of it was absorbed into the rites early on, but it was later discarded in this clarification and cleaning process that Xenophanes was one of the proponents of. And that was done at least 200 years before Christ. It was already ready. All traditions was evicted. All of the knowledge was taken away. Anaximander said that knowledge could be the enemy of man, and therefore they took it away. And since knowledge can only grow from history, the things we learn, that actually cleared out the basis for understanding. And I think this is what this Indian chief of the Taos Republic, Ochiwai Obion, had understood, and he was able to sort of communicate that to Carl Jung. But we need to put this also in a specific perspective. What are the chances that somebody who hasn't grown up in the West can actually make this detailed information? And I would say, as even Richard E. Lin points out, this is very rare. He must have been a very specific person, this Biano Ochiwai. It's extremely interesting, and much of his book that goes from the subject of antiquity and our own specific development take a lot of force from this specific saying that Carl Jung recorded, which is in itself very interesting. How we try to escape the material world and we also take away the spiritual world. And it is these things with contradiction that are so well established until you go back and understand contradiction is a necessity. I was especially thinking of the god Shiva in India, who's both the god of goodness and of evil at the same time. It's both the destroyer and the constructor. And that is almost always the case with goddesses and also of virtue. And nobody would blame somebody to make money. And when I went to China, everybody of the temple made money. Even the priests were selling things. They tried to make money. But one thing doesn't hinder another thing. It's that Greek thinking that is so well established in our system, in our bodies. And since it wasn't even verbalized, how can you escape it? You just imitate directly from your parents. How they move, that disjunct between body and soul is already well established. And Ochoa Ibiano said that actually was shown in the stature when you slump together, don't have this openness to the world anymore. And that understanding of the body, no thinking can change that. Only a bodily change can change that, because the disjunct we have between the soul and the heart consciousness is made in our bodies. Do not try to attack it with thinking, learning in an abstract way. You need to change your body, and that can only be done by practice. A practice that is old. He actually suggests yoga or some other Chinese systems for learning via the body. It's absolutely important. If you don't do that, if you don't do the body learning, your body will have the distinction. If you say to yourself, well, I took the way distinction in my head, that is just wrong. It can never ever happen, because the bodies are a part of our reality. Well, look at the yoga system. He goes into that. The yoga system is a spiritual development using the body. That would be a contradiction in Western eyes. Here we usually hit the body with a whip, what they call the flagellants. The priests,
flagellation,
and austerity, not drinking, not eating, being in celibacy and so forth, like really hurting the body as much as you can by then becoming spiritual. That is not the open way of, for instance, the spiritual way in China. You do open off to both ways at the same time. And actually, contradiction is a necessity. You need to go in both directions, because the yin and yang is a contradiction. It's evil on one side and good on the other. Because from that, this alatea and thea, comes reality and true direction and true goodness. So it's an important thing to accept the world of contradictions. I think that's part of the point in Richard E. Lind. And I think it's a good point to stop here when the music may be stopping as well. Sorry for the disturbances. There is a big music show going on here in the Central Park in Gothenburg. I say thank you very much for your patience, and see you soon. Bye bye.
Thank you.